But I've actually experienced many failures, many project failures. And I can see some of my co-authors from TUM nodding their heads to this. And I'm sure most of you have engaged in projects that are very important to you, but you've actually experienced failure. And then when you experience failure, people often come up to you and say, look, you learn more from your failures than from your successes. And in some ways, this has some resonance with me, is that if you try something new and fail, the failure captures your attention. You try and explain it. You try and overcome those mistakes in order to achieve success in the future. And this is very relevant to entrepreneurship, because entrepreneurship is the pursuit of opportunity. Opportunities only exist in environments of high uncertainty. So the more entrepreneurial we are, the more we're experimenting into the unknown, and we're going to have failures. We're going to make mistakes. So when I was a PhD student a long time ago, back at Bond University in Australia, I wanted to teach this to my students. So I searched all the textbooks, and there was very little written about failure. It was always about success, high growth, high gazelles, but very little about failure. But I did find one textbook, the Timmins textbook, that mentioned in a couple of lines the notion about learning from failure. And it said this, that businesses fail, entrepreneurs learn. Failure is the fire that tempers the steel and the entrepreneur's street savvy, which simply means that while businesses fail, entrepreneurs do not. They learn, they are motivated to try again, and they proceed. And even in the textbook, he more or less says, in order to be successful, you first must have many failures. So the underlying assumption here is that learning from failure is somewhat automatic and instantaneous. But one day I went back to my office after teaching my class and I got a phone call from my father. And he said that the business that he'd created 30-odd years ago was in trouble. When we discussed how much trouble, we decided we had to close the business down, and we had to close it down immediately. That caused us great financial devastation. Our family, we lost everything, absolutely everything. Worse was that Dad was an emotional wreck. He was very upset with the people that had let him down. He was very disappointed in himself because he wasn't able to fulfill obligations to other people. But importantly, he thought not only was he a failure as a business person, but he felt that he was a failure as a father because he was unable to hand the business on to my brother. That caused him great anxiety, and it caused me great anxiety, our whole family. And so when I thought back about those assumptions about learning from failure as automatic and instantaneous, it just didn't ring true in this particular instance. So the emotions that my dad was feeling were actually emotions that we can talk about as grief. Now, we normally think about grief in terms of the death of a loved one. And there's no way that I'm saying the death of a project or the death of a business is the same as the death of a loved one. You'd obviously rather have a death of a project every day of the week than lose a loved one. But the symptoms are similar. In fact, they've found grief in people who have had amputations, cardiac surgery, and divorce. So grief is the negative emotional reaction to the loss of something important. So if we can understand why projects or businesses are important to us, we can understand why we have such a large negative emotional reaction when we lose them through failure. So I just want to give you an example here, a very short example. And we see here a pyramid of children. In fact, 2 of those children are my children, and the other 4 are my nieces. So this is a family photograph back in Australia. And you can see that they're very happy. They also have high psychological well-being. And we have high psychological well-being because we can satisfy 3 fundamental psychological needs that we have. The psychological need for competence, for belongingness, and for autonomy. And so here they're satisfying their need for competence by building something creative, something strong, something so strong that little Emily is able to stand on top of it, and they're receiving positive feedback as a result. They satisfy their psychological need for belongingness because each member of that pyramid is very important to the strength of the pyramid. But it's also reinforcing the notion of belongingness as part of a family. They are a family unit. And they're also satisfying their psychological need for autonomy because they created the game, they chose the structure, and there's no parent intervention here at all. Businesses are important to entrepreneurs. Entrepreneurs create and build wealth for society, perhaps for themselves, but also for society, and they're learning new skills and abilities as they go. They're also able to satisfy their psychological need for belongingness by their relationships with their top management team, their employees, their stakeholders, perhaps entrepreneurship associations. And they're also able to satisfy their need for autonomy because in the end, they are the boss. I mean, they make the decisions, they have some control over their destiny. And I encourage all of you to think about the projects that you work on. The ones that are most important are those that satisfy your psychological needs for competence, for belongingness, and autonomy. So the more important the projects are in satisfying those things, the more grief we're going to feel when they fail. When we think about grief over the death of a loved one, we know a lot of psychological literature about this, and most of you will think about grief work as the most common approach to dealing with grief. Grief work involves thinking about the events that led up to the failure or to the loss. And what you try and do is try and create an account for why the loss occurred. If we can create that understanding or we can develop that meaning, we're able to break the emotional bonds to the object or to the person that's lost. And as we're able to do that, perhaps we're able to remove the emotional obstacles to being able to learn from failure. The only thing is, in my research, we've found that those people who use this loss orientation for an extended period of time start to find that their levels of negative emotions and grief begin to escalate over time rather than decrease. Another approach that we can use to cope with grief is a restoration orientation. And a restoration orientation has two elements to it. One is to distract yourself from thinking about the failure. If I don't think about the events leading up to the loss, then they're unlikely to trigger this negative emotional reaction, and I can avoid grief. The second part is being proactive towards secondary causes of stress. For example, an entrepreneur whose business failed needs to go and apply for unemployment benefits, look for a job, sell their house, perhaps move the children's school. But by addressing those secondary causes of stress, when they turn to the primary stressor, the business failure, it may no longer loom as large as it previously had. The only problem with this approach is it's very hard to think about how you're going to learn from failure when you're distracting yourself from thinking about the events that led to the failure. Also, if you distract yourself and you don't trigger the emotion, then the emotion doesn't motivate the ability to learn from the failure experience. So what our research found was that people who are most effective at being able to reduce grief and to be able to learn from the experience oscillated between a loss orientation and a restoration orientation. So for example, you might start with a loss orientation by focusing on the events leading up to the loss and talking about it with other people. And as we do that, we start to build an account for why the failure occurred. But as our negative emotions start to escalate, we switch to a restoration orientation. We distract ourselves from thinking about it, perhaps by going to a football game, perhaps by spending some time with friends, but also by addressing some of the secondary causes of stress. And then when our emotional batteries are recharged, we switch back to a loss orientation and again build a more and more plausible story behind why the failure occurred. And then as negative emotions escalate, we switch. So it's this oscillation that more quickly reduces the level of grief and can actually increase our ability to learn from failure. So at this stage, I've spoken mainly about how individuals deal with it, but now I want to talk about what do organisations do as a result of this. And I want to start off with an example of a project that happened within an organisation that was a failure. This is the Wonder Sauna Hot Pants. You wear these plastic pants, you inflate them, and there must be some heating device such that when you wear the pants, you actually feel the benefits of the sauna. The advertising for this says, "Slenderize where you want." And the man in the picture seems very happy about this. It also says, "One size fits all and easy to inflate." But surprisingly, or not surprisingly, this project failed. But those people involved with the project perhaps had a wider vision. Perhaps they wanted to take sauna pants to the masses or something. But it was important to them, and perhaps they felt grief when it failed. In fact, some of the research that we've done involving research scientists here at Technical University of Munich have found that they become very attached to their projects, and when those projects fail, they do experience grief, and that grief can obstruct their ability to learn from failure. But this creates a dilemma for organisations. What do we do as an organisation? We want to be entrepreneurial, we want to pursue opportunities, this is how we're going to grow. We realise that failure is part of doing that. But on the other hand, as projects fail, people feel grief, and that obstructs our ability to learn from the experience. So organisations really have two approaches. One is where they try to normalise failure. They say, look, failure is just part of the entrepreneurial process. Don't allow it to trigger these negative emotions. In other words, become desensitised to failure. But the problem here again is that if you desensitise people and they take emotion out as an outcome, perhaps you take it out as an input as well. People don't make the emotional investments, the emotional commitment, the passion towards those projects, which actually increases the likelihood that the project is going to fail. The other type is really an emotionally capable organisation. And I use the example here of an Irish wake. An Irish wake is actually a party that people have to celebrate the life of someone who's died. And we know that we have rituals such as funerals. We've actually found evidence that within some organisations, they send out invitation to a wake. And people get together and have this parting ceremony to say goodbye to the project that has failed. These emotionally capable organisations also have social support groups. Now, currently, those social support groups are used for other means of regulating emotions, but we believe that they could be used in the case of project failure. So, we're all going to experience failure, and in failing, we're going to lose something that's important to us. Can we learn from failure? Yes, we can, but we know that it's not automatic and it's not instantaneous, that it's going to involve grief, and we're going to have to be able to manage and regulate our emotions. When thinking about this topic and thinking about my children, I said, well, I would like to try and help my children so that they wouldn't feel the pain associated with the failure. But to do that, I'd have to take emotion out of the projects, and I don't want to do that. I want them to be passionate and make emotional investments into their projects. And I also don't want to rob them of the opportunity to learn from their failure experiences. So how can I help them? I think I can help them by building their emotional intelligence so they know how to use a loss orientation, how to use a restoration orientation, and know when and how to switch between the two. I encourage you to make the most of your failures. Thank you. Good night.